had a choice. You could either vote for Marshall's confirmation or you could remain in the Senate. And when Thurgood Marshall's son, Thurgood Marshall Jr., finished law school, he's now in the same law firm, a partner in the same law firm as my daughter-in-law at Washington. But that Hollings hired him for a staff of a committee he chaired. And but Hollings understood that this state learned a lesson from the Civil War in the long term. And some years ago, a few decades ago, there was an encyclopedia of Southern history. And the entry on South Carolina was titled A Quest for Stability. So when the Civil Rights crisis came to South Carolina, Hollings met I.D. Quincy Newman, who had one of the shrewdest political minds. He was field secretary for the NAACP in South Carolina. He really ran the organization. And for 12 years, he was a Methodist minister by training, but he had a very acute political mind. And so Hollings would see him on a regular basis. And he would get sort of early warning signals of something where someplace in the state where there's trouble brewing or conflict developing, and could intercede early. And South Carolina always remained, the NAACP always remained the dominant civil rights organization in South Carolina. It had a statewide network of branches. It was the South Carolina Conference of Branches of the NAACP. And it had a great influence, and Hollings worked with them, and so when something serious would come up, he would get early warning and frequently intercede. And he would also listen. And when Harvey Gantt of Charleston, who is the architect who designed the new Burke High School, he's also a graduate of Burke High School, but when he enrolled at Clemson, a week before he enrolled at Clemson to break the color line in South Carolina. This was 4 months after the riots at Ole Miss, when James Meredith entered there. And Hollings said that to the legislature, in the legislature there's a lot of uncertainty. Which way should we go? And this shows the impact of leadership, real leadership. And Hollings said that we've run out of courts, and we've run out of time, and we must adjust to changing circumstances. We must do it for the good of our nation and the good of our state. We must determine whether we are a government of laws or a government of people. And when Harvey Gantt enrolled at Clemson, there were no riots, there was no altercation at all. You had plenty of national press there. And the NBC correspondent at Clemson at the time called NBC headquarters in New York to tell them what had happened. And the editor in charge said, well, there's no story. And the reporter started screaming into his telephone, explaining that this was indeed a story, and he prevailed. And so when the Civil Rights Act of probably everybody in this room is quite familiar with South Carolina educational television. It's one of the best systems in the country, and particularly in public radio. Any place in South Carolina you can listen to NPR. And the story behind that is that before school desegregation before Gantt had enrolled, there was a belief that we will have to close the public school system. So how are you going to educate people? And Henry Cawthon, who later became general manager and president of director of chief executive of SCETV, was then an 19-year-old technician at a television station in Columbia, and he explained to his father, John Cawthon, who was the executive director of the South Carolina Textile Manufacturers Association, which was then the dominant industry, and John Colson was the most powerful lobbyist in the state by far. How you could have a closed circuit system and send people could go to classes at home. Now, it's not long after then, Gantt and Rose, the attitudes begin to change. They got a top school principal in the state who was a native to Indiana who saw a much bigger role for public television. And so it is today what it is. And I think it's a great service for the state. And, if the legislature doesn't shut it down. But anyway, this closed circuit system, when the '64 Civil Rights Act is passed and Title VII Equal Employment Opportunity takes effect in 1960, a year later in '65, the textile manufacturers get all their top management together at various sites around the state. Hollings also, of course, created the tech system in South Carolina. You know, without tech, there would be no BMW in the state. Same thing, there would be without the Port of Charleston, there definitely would be no BMW in the state, but that's a different issue. But, and Hollings is the one who got that passed over strong legislative objection by legislative leaders. The dominant power in the state rested in Barnwell County, the Barnwell Ring, State Senator Edgar Brown and House Speaker Solomon Blott. And sometimes the state would come to a total halt governmentally, because in those days every county had a senator, and the smaller counties had at least one representative. And sometimes Mr. Brown and Mr. Blott couldn't agree on the county supply bill, which was the county budget. No county council in those days. You know, should the sheriff get an extra deputy this year, or should he not get an extra deputy this year? And things would come to a halt. John Cawthon, who had developed a close relationship separately with each of them, I won't get into the details, he'd go down and sort of bring things together, and they'd end up with compromise. So Cawthon went to those two and explained this idea for ETV, and that's really how it got funded. When Hollings was governor, he had the agreement in the state budget for appropriation to create a technical education system, or the first part of it, which was going to be these, one part of tech is that when a company comes in, Boeing's a good example, all the training for the workforce is paid by the state, even if they were to hire Boeing representatives to do the training. And so they did all the testing to pull it, to get people who had the right skill sets, and they would have the jobs characterized. These jobs took 6 months of training, these 3, these 2, these 1. And on opening day, you had a fully trained workforce ready to move into the factory. And so that was much more effective than what was going on elsewhere in the South with tax breaks. And Hollings had it all figured out, except he learned at the last minute that Senator Brown, at the final meeting and the final markup in the Senate Appropriations Committee, it said we're going to strike it. So Hollings once told me that said he didn't keep any liquor in the governor's office because he knew every reporter would be looking for Governor from Charleston to have liquor in the State House. So he had a guy, Walter Brown, the sinking fund director, who he told him to send a couple of bottles of bourbon down to the finance committee with paper cups. And so he told him what the situation was, and he listened, and Senator Brown said, and if Senator Brown said it, that's the way the committee was going to vote. So, well, Governor, he said, we just don't have the money to do this. We can't do it. And Hollings just spontaneously said, well, I guess you just have to make a liar out of your governor. I said, what do you mean? And Hollings had seen a prototype in Ohio about this. That's how he learned about it. And he said, well, I had 2 companies that are planning to build plants in